Some employers across the country have been worried that workers are unwilling to return to their jobs as help wanted signs decorate the storefronts of businesses across the country. But some are taking a classic economics response and have begun to increase wages in order to incentivize job seekers to return. That seems to be working.
In Pittsburgh, one ice cream parlor filled 16 positions overnight after increasing their starting pay from $7.25 to $15 per hour. Co-host of the Bad Faith podcast and former national spokesperson for the Bernie Sanders campaign, Briahna Joy Gray, she joins us now to weigh in. What do you make of this national trend, Briahna, where we're seeing both a reassessment of work on behalf of workers and a large rise in wages really across the country?
Well, it seems like workers have a better sense of the value of their labor than the companies that have been able to exploit them because of very, very low work standards in this country for a long time. Look, we live in the longest period without a minimum wage raise since the minimum wage was instated in 1938. Restaurant workers, for instance, have been earning $2.13 an hour since 1991. Oh. It shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that workers are underpaid, and in a world where they have any kind of flexibility, any kind of relief in the form of these stimulus payments, that they're going to have the more efficient behavior, stay home with their kids, not have to take on those child care costs, and take the time to look for a job that actually values the work that they do.
You know, Briahna, it's just wild to me that usually our political discourse only considers like the stick approach. Like, how do we make life so terrible that people are forced into these low wage positions? And normally when you work a job like at a restaurant or some in retail where you're barely making it, you can't take time off. I mean, you're just trying to keep body and soul together. You don't have time to do a reassessment and think like, okay, is there another industry I could go into or get a little bit of training for where I would make a higher wage? And so the pandemic forced everybody in some of these low wage spaces to stay home and forced them to have the space to rethink whether they really wanted to be making $7.25 an hour. And by the way, during a pandemic, risking their lives for that low wage job. So I do think it's indicative of a little bit of a rethink that's happening essentially at all class levels in society.
Right. Well, the government loves to use a stick for poor people. It is very happy to use carrots for rich people. We've all heard about trickle-down economics. We all know that billionaires got $1.6 trillion, I believe, $1.62 trillion richer over the course of the pandemic. The number one beneficiaries of PPP, et cetera. The first COVID bill was the largest upward transfer of wealth in American history. I mean, the government feels no hesitation in saying that if we give rich people more money, it will incentivize them to act better and it will trickle down and help the rest of us. And it's nice to see that at least there's a little sliver of hope that it's clear now to people that that's the same kind of incentive structure that works for working people. In fact, I think it actually works for working people in a way that it never was true of the very wealthy.
You know, and it's funny, Briahna, I've watched, a lot of these red states are canceling additional unemployment, not just red, actually many Democrats talking about it as well. There's a very easy fix. You actually don't have to take it away. You can just make it so that you can also take a job and keep supplemental income for a specific time period. That would make it both easier for a business, which doesn't necessarily have the funds in order to pay higher wages, and gets people back to work. And yet, I don't hear that one getting talked about, except maybe on Twitter every once in a while.
Yeah, look, there's not a lot of respect for working people, and it's not one party or the other. I think that there's different rhetoric that are used by each, but when you come down to brass tacks and what they're willing to do and willing to fight for, it becomes quite obvious. I read an article recently that talked about how, the $50 minimum wage didn't make it into the COVID bill. Well, no, Democrats took it out of the COVID bill, so there never had to be an actual vote up or down or whether or not these Congress members supported it, the senators supported a minimum wage, right? And when you see the kind of costs that are attached to government support systems historically, requirements to work to get welfare payments, no understanding that work requires mothers then to have to go and get outside health childcare that is going to undermine the point of them working anyway. People not having the time and space to actually get the education they need to ramp up themselves into a different career trajectory. Over and over and over again, there's these costs attached to people actually bettering themselves, because I think that there's a bipartisan understanding that the status quo requires people to be in a coercive labor position where their labor can be freely traded around by these corporations that have no interest in what these people's lives are actually going to be like. If we want to live in a community, if we want to actually have a country that's functioning and have people not living in destitution because that's what's best for corporations, then we have to start changing our framework and our policy framework.
That is so true. And Briahna, I have to ask you, I mean, we've learned a lot about just this week about what parts of the supposed Biden agenda have just been totally pushed off. I mean, you mentioned the $15 minimum wage. We haven't heard anything about that in quite a while. But Biden's budget request doesn't include money for public option, something that was already the most conservative position of any of the Democratic candidates. That's now off the table. Prescription drug reform, just negotiating with drug companies. That's not in the budget request either. Also saying we're not actually going to eliminate any student debt. Not all of it, not 50,000, not 10, none of it. That's not being contemplated anymore. I mean, what do you make of that?
Not lowering the Medicare age. It is a flagrant rejection of all of his core campaign promises. And a couple of weeks ago, there were a flood of articles with quotes from progressives saying that Joe Biden had met their expectations. Joe Biden hasn't even met his own expectations that were set by his own campaign. There are political ads that are still up on his website where he's promising that the reason that we can't have Medicare for all, I understand, I'm a compassionate guy, I understand why it's appealing to people, but we can't start over from scratch. We have to reform Obamacare. We need a public option. And all of those promises were used to cleave Americans from the policies they really wanted, things that could really demonstrably change their lives, and settle on Joe Biden because he might not be the best, but he can beat Trump. And now he has flagrantly denied even those minimalist, incrementalist policies, and he hopes to have any chance at keeping Congress in 2022. He's setting himself up for failure. And the most cynical read of that would be to say he's doing so that he no longer has to pretend that it's a parliamentarian or Kirsten Sinema that's keeping him from doing any number of things, including by executive order, including passing parts of the George Floyd Act, I should add, since we're one day out from the anniversary of his murder. There are many things he could do by executive order, and he's choosing not to do them because he is motivated by different interests than the people that actually elected him.
Yeah.
Making it plain as always. Thank you, Briahna. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Next up on Rising, friend of the show, Jeff Stein. He's going to join us to talk about Biden's tax plan pushback from Democrats when Rising returns.